For that, I'm back in a course project. And the part I want to handle with dynamic components is here on the login. When I enter incorrect credentials, at the moment, we then have that spinner and then we see that error message there. Now, nothing wrong with that way of displaying an error. It's perfectly fine. You don't have to change that. But to demonstrate how you could load a component dynamically, I will change it. I will not use that box here, but instead we'll build a very simple alert box, which is presented as an overlay here on the screen with a nice backdrop that hides the background. And in that alert box, we can then simply click OK to get rid of it and have another try here. So that's the idea. Let me now go back to code. And here, the goal now is to first of all build such an alert. And I'll do that in the shared folder. I'll name that alert. And in there, I'll create my alert.component.ts file where, well, I want to build that alert component. Now, my alert component here will be a simple box that, is loaded as an overlay on the entire screen. And therefore, let's here export a class alert component like this and give it that add component decorator. Now, in that decorator, I'll assign a selector, app alert, and add the template URL where I want to point at an external template, the alert.component.html file, which we therefore also have to create in that same folder. And that is my basic component for now. Now, the alert component here then receives, of course, some markup. And here I will include both the backdrop and that overlay box in one and the same component. Of course, you could also split this into multiple components. So here we'll write some custom CSS actually, and I'll add a div with a class of backdrop. That will be the backdrop, so basically that thing in the background that blocks access to the rest of the page and ensures that the focus is on the alert box. And that box is the second div I'll add here. I'll give that a class of alert box, something like this, to not interfere with the alert class provided by Bootstrap, because I don't want to use that. And in that alert box here, I'll keep this really simple. I'll just add a paragraph where we can output the message with string interpolation, and that is referring to a message property we haven't added yet to the component. We'll do that soon. And I also want to have a button to close that alert. Therefore, I'll add another div here. I'll name this alert box actions. So that's my class name here. And in that div, I'll add a button with class button primary. Now I'm using Bootstrap classes here again to get that button styling. And here we can just say close. So this could be an alert box. It's missing some styling. So let me add an alert component.css file here as well, and point at that file in our component declaration here. So style URLs receives a pointer at alert.component.css. So far, so good. Now, in the alert component, I do have that message property which I want to output, and therefore, in the alert component TypeScript file, we need that message property, and that will be a string, and it should be settable from outside. And therefore, you learned that we can add input here, and the input needs to be imported from @AngularCore to make this settable from outside. With that, the alert component is almost finished. Let's now add it to the app module here, add it to the declarations there, the alert component, and now let's see how we could add it. Well, we could go to our auth component, to the template there, of course. And there, right now, I do have that alert box, which is shown when we do have an error. Now I'll comment that out and instead use app alert here. And there we have to set the message property, which we made bindable with input. And I'll set this to error. And I'll show the entire alert box here with the app alert element only if we have an error. So now we're simply just showing our own alert component. So far, nothing too fancy, of course. Now, this custom alert component now will receive some styling, and I'll start with the backdrop, so that thing in the background. That will get a fixed position, top 0, left 0, a width of 100 VW actually, which is the viewport width, so not the not percentage to not take the container width, but the entire viewport width. A height of 100 VH to take the entire viewport height as well. Then a background of RGBA 00.75, which is a slightly transparent black background color. A set index of, let's say, 50 to be above all the other elements that could be there. And yeah, that should be it. Now the alert box, this is the other element we have, should also get some styling. First of all, this will get a position of fixed too. Top here could be, let's say, 30 VH to have it 30% inside of the viewport, to not have it sit right at the top of the viewport. The left will actually be, let's say, 20 VW. The width of this thing here will then be 60 VW, because then we have 20 to the left and 20 to the right to center this nicely. I'll not set a height. The height should be determined by the content that's in there. And I'll give it a padding, though, of, let's say, 16 pixels. A set index of 100 to be above of the backdrop. A background color of white. And a slight box shadow with these settings here to hopefully make it look good. So that's my alert box. Now we also have that alert box actions class, which holds that button where we can close everything. And there I just want to add text align right to push this all the way to the right. Now, of course, you can adjust this however you want. Let's see this. Let's wait for this to reload and then enter some incorrect credentials here. And here is our alert box. This is nice modal now. And of course, you could go way more advanced here. You could use ng content to pass dynamic DOM into that box here, whatever you want. But this is our box. Of course, at the moment, we can't close it though. But creating that is the first step. Now, how can we load this dynamically? And of course, also, how can we then close it? It is important to understand that dynamic components in general just means that you wanna display some component dynamically, which means it's not always there, but it's there once something specific happens in your code. Therefore, you typically want to control programmatically when that component should be loaded, when it should be displayed. And you already learned about a way of doing that, and we're currently using that way. And that way is ngIf. ngIf is awesome because it allows you to use a declarative approach, which means you simply add that component selector in your template, and then you use ngIf to still only load it upon a certain condition. So you use ngIf to control whether the DOM really has that component or not. And therefore, ngIf definitely is a great approach of loading a component dynamically. It saves you a lot of extra work, which you will have to do with the alternative approach you're about to learn, and it's definitely worth a thought and has no major downsides. And at the moment, as I mentioned, we are using ngIf here in this project. We're using it in many places, and we're also using it for this alert box. And I'll show you how to finish the entire alert flow before we then have a look at that alternative. Nonetheless, what would be the alternative? The alternative is that you use something which in the past was named Dynamic Component Loader. Now, this was a helper utility that doesn't exist anymore or that you shouldn't use anymore. But in the end, it's now about a general concept, you could say, of creating a component in code and then manually attaching it to the DOM. So there you have to control in your code by yourself how that component is instantiated, that data is passed into it, and also that it is removed. So everything ngIf does for you, you have to do on your own there. Still, this approach can be useful. It also, of course, allows you to control it entirely from code, and you don't have to touch the template. Sometimes you might not want to do that, or you have no real way of adding the component to the template. And therefore, this is also an interesting approach. Now, we'll have a look at both here. We started with ngIf. Let's finish it up with that approach before we then dive into creating components and managing components from code. So we started with ngIf, and therefore at the moment our alert component here is simply included with its selector and controlled with ngIf. The huge advantage of this is that we don't have to manually create it, and we also can pass data in as we learn it here with property binding. It also means that listening to events is super simple and straightforward. If we want to make sure we can also get rid of that alert, all we need to do is we need to emit an event, and we make that event listenable from outside with the help of add_output, which you import from AddAngularCore. And we could name this close, and this will be, or will hold a new event emitter, which we import also from AddAngularCore. And that event emitter could now also transport some data, but here I'll actually add void as a type because I won't emit any data. I'll just emit the hey, this was closed event. Now to emit this, we need a method here. For example, onClose, and now this will be triggered whenever a user clicks this close button or the backdrop. So here we can register a click listener and fire onClose, and we do the same when the backdrop is clicked, let's say, to dismiss the modal in that case as well. So both these things, the backdrop and this button, will trigger onClose, and in onClose we can now simply use the close event we created and manually emit it. Now this allows us to go back to the off component, and in there we can now listen to close, and here we can now call on handle error, for example, whatever you want to name it. This is a method we now have to add to the off component, maybe here. And in on handle error, I essentially just want to reset the error, so I'll set error back to null. And by doing that, the condition for displaying the error will be removed because we're using error here in ngIf, and if that is null, then this whole alert will not be shown anymore, and therefore this will then close the alert. So let's try this again. Let's enter invalid credentials. Here is the alert. If I click here, we get rid of it. If I now enter invalid credentials again, let's try the close button, works too. So now this is the finished flow with ngIf, and I strongly recommend using that flow. There are rarely situations where you absolutely need the imperative approach you're also going to learn about. Using this approach with ngIf is so much easier, and therefore really is an approach you should use when you have a scenario where you need to show some component dynamically when some condition is met. Nonetheless, let's now see how we could create that alert component entirely in code and control it from there.